The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as General Marcus Blackwood adjusted his uniform before the mirror. At 52, he commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His weathered face bore the scars of countless battles, but it was his cold, calculating eyes that made even his most seasoned officers uncomfortable. The general had built his reputation on absolute control and zero tolerance for what he perceived as insubordination. Colonel Sarah Mitchell had been dreading this meeting for weeks. As the head of military intelligence, she had uncovered disturbing evidence about illegal arms deals that traced back to high-ranking officials. Her investigation had led her down a dangerous path, one that threatened to expose corruption at the highest levels of the military hierarchy. Sarah knew that presenting this information would be like walking into a lion's den, but her oath to serve with honor left her no choice. The briefing room was sterile and intimidating, with its polished table and portraits of past commanders staring down from the walls. General Blackwood sat at the head of the table, his fingers drumming impatiently against the mahogany surface. His aide, Lieutenant Torres, stood nervously by the door, while two armed guards flanked the entrance. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Sarah entered, carrying a leather briefcase containing the evidence that would change everything. "You're 3 minutes late, Colonel." Blackwood's voice cut through the silence like a blade. His tone carried the weight of authority mixed with barely contained irritation. Sarah had worked under him for 2 years, and she had witnessed his explosive temper on numerous occasions. She had seen him humiliate junior officers for minor infractions and destroy careers with a single word. Today, however, she carried information that could destroy his career instead. Sarah placed her briefcase on the table and looked directly at the general. "Sir, I have urgent intelligence that requires your immediate attention. My team has discovered evidence of weapons trafficking that involves several high-ranking military personnel." Her voice remained steady despite the gravity of what she was about to reveal. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, knowing that the general's reaction would be explosive. The general's expression darkened as Sarah began to present her findings. Documents spread across the table showed bank transfers, shipping manifests, and communication records that painted a damning picture of corruption. As she spoke, Blackwood's jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable, linking him directly to a network of illegal arms sales to foreign mercenaries. "These allegations are preposterous," Blackwood snarled, his face flushing red with anger. "You're suggesting that I would betray everything I've sworn to protect?" His voice rose with each word, echoing off the walls of the briefing room. Sarah could see the rage building in his eyes, the same look she had witnessed before he destroyed other officers who had dared to challenge him. Lieutenant Torres shifted uncomfortably by the door, sensing the dangerous turn the meeting was taking. The two guards, Sergeant Adams and Corporal Johnson, remained at attention but exchanged worried glances. Both men had served under Blackwood for years and had witnessed his violent outbursts before. They knew the signs of an impending explosion, and the tension in the room was approaching a breaking point. Sarah continued her presentation despite the general's growing hostility. "Sir, the evidence is clear. These transactions occurred under your authorization codes, and the timing coincides with your overseas missions. I understand this is difficult to hear, but we must address this situation before it escalates further." Her military training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but she could feel her heart racing as Blackwood's anger reached dangerous levels. The general stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You dare question my loyalty? My integrity?" His voice boomed through the room as he began pacing behind his chair. "I've bled for this country while you were still in diapers. I've made decisions that kept this nation safe while politicians played games in air-conditioned offices." His words dripped with contempt and barely controlled rage. Sarah remained seated, her posture straight and professional. "General, I'm not questioning your past service. I'm presenting evidence that demands investigation. It's my duty to report these findings, regardless of who's involved." Her calm demeanor only seemed to fuel Blackwood's anger further. He had expected her to back down, to show the same fear that others displayed when confronted with his wrath. The briefing room fell silent except for the sound of Blackwood's heavy breathing. The general stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on Sarah with pure hatred. In his mind, she represented everything he despised about the new generation of officers, educated, principled, and unwilling to look the other way when faced with uncomfortable truths. He had built his empire on loyalty and force through fear, and Sarah's defiance threatened everything he had worked to create. Lieutenant Torres recognized the dangerous shift in his commander's demeanor. He had seen this look before, usually right before someone's career ended in disgrace. The young officer pressed himself against the wall, trying to become invisible as the confrontation escalated. He knew that intervening would mean the end of his own military career, but staying silent felt like complicity in whatever was about to unfold. Sergeant Adams, one of the guards, had served in combat zones alongside General Blackwood. He respected the man's tactical brilliance and his ability to make tough decisions under pressure. However, he had also witnessed the general's darker side during peacetime operations. Adams had seen Blackwood destroy careers over personal vendettas and use his position to silence anyone who threatened his authority. The sergeant's loyalty was being tested as he watched the confrontation unfold. Corporal Johnson was newer to the unit, but had quickly learned to fear his commanding officer. He had heard stories from other soldiers about Blackwood's legendary temper and his willingness to use physical intimidation to maintain control. As the tension in the room reached a fever pitch, Johnson's hand instinctively moved closer to his weapon, a subconscious preparation for whatever might come next. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She knew that presenting this evidence would have consequences, but she had underestimated the depth of Blackwood's corruption and his willingness to protect it at any cost. The documents before her represented months of careful investigation, and she had triple-checked every detail to ensure accuracy. There was no doubt about the general's guilt, but proving it in a military court would require her to survive this confrontation first. The general's breathing became more labored as he struggled to control his rage. In his mind, Sarah's accusations weren't just an attack on his reputation. They were a direct challenge to his authority and a threat to everything he had built. He had spent decades climbing the military hierarchy, eliminating anyone who stood in his way, and he wasn't about to let a junior officer destroy him now. As the silence stretched on, Sarah began to gather her documents, sensing that the meeting was about to take a dangerous turn. She had delivered the information as required by military protocol, and now she needed to ensure that the evidence reached the appropriate investigative authorities. However, as she reached for the briefcase, General Blackwood's patience finally snapped, setting in motion a chain of events that would end his career in the most dramatic way possible. The explosion came without warning. General Blackwood's hand shot across the table, striking Colonel Mitchell's face with a resounding crack that echoed through the briefing room. The force of the blow sent her stumbling backward, her carefully organized documents scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. Sarah's hand instinctively went to her burning cheek as she stared at her commanding officer in shock, unable to process what had just happened. Lieutenant Torres froze against the wall, his eyes wide with disbelief. In all his years of military service, he had never witnessed a superior officer strike a subordinate during an official briefing. The young lieutenant's mind raced as he tried to comprehend the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. This wasn't just a loss of temper. It was a complete breakdown of military discipline and a violation of everything the armed forces stood for. Sergeant Adams and Corporal Johnson stood motionless at their posts, their training warring with their conscience. Both men had sworn an oath to follow lawful orders from their superiors, but they had also sworn to uphold justice and protect those who served alongside them. The general's assault on Colonel Mitchell fell clearly outside the bounds of acceptable military conduct, yet their years of conditioning made it difficult to act against a superior officer. "How dare you come into my office with these lies?" Blackwood roared, his face twisted with rage. Spittle flew from his lips as he towered over Sarah, his massive frame casting a shadow across the scattered documents. "You think you can destroy me with fabricated evidence and conspiracy theories? I've crushed better officers than you for far less." His voice had taken on a dangerous edge, the tone of a man who had completely lost control of his emotions. Sarah slowly straightened, her military training kicking in despite the shock of the assault. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth where Blackwood's ring had cut her lip, but Her eyes remained defiant. "General, striking a fellow officer is a court-martial offense," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the pain and humiliation she felt. "Nothing you do now will change the evidence I've uncovered." The general's response was swift and brutal. His hand moved again, this time catching Sarah across the temple with enough force to send her crashing into the wall. Her head struck the portrait of a former commander, and she slumped to the floor, momentarily dazed. The briefing room fell into stunned silence as everyone processed the escalating violence of their commanding officer. Blackwood stood over Sarah's fallen form, breathing heavily like an animal that had just made a kill. In his mind, he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the only way forward was to eliminate the threat entirely. "You should have minded your own business, Colonel," he snarled. "Some secrets are worth killing for, and some people are too dangerous to let live." Lieutenant Torres found his voice first, though it came out as barely a whisper. "General, sir, perhaps we should." He never finished the sentence as Blackwood's withering glare silenced him immediately. The young officer pressed himself further against the wall, realizing that he was now a witness to assault, and possibly worse. His career, his future, everything he had worked for was now hanging in the balance. Sarah struggled to regain her footing, using the wall for support as her vision cleared. The taste of blood filled her mouth, and she could feel swelling beginning around her left eye. Despite her injuries, her resolve only strengthened. She had spent years building the case against Blackwood and his associates, and she wouldn't let his violence intimidate her into silence. "You can beat me, General, but you can't beat the truth," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. The general's face contorted with fury as he realized that Sarah wouldn't be easily broken. Throughout his career, he had used intimidation and violence to maintain control, crushing anyone who dared to challenge his authority. He had built his reputation on being unpredictable and dangerous, ensuring that his subordinates feared him too much to question his actions. Sarah's continued defiance was something he had never encountered before, and it drove him to even greater heights of rage. Sergeant Adams watched in horror as his commanding officer completely lost control. The sergeant had served in 3 combat deployments and had seen the worst that war could offer, but nothing had prepared him for witnessing this kind of domestic violence within his own unit. His hand twitched toward his weapon as he struggled with the conflicting loyalties that tore at his military training. Corporal Johnson's face had gone pale as he watched the assault unfold. The young soldier had joined the military to serve his country with honor, but what he was witnessing bore no resemblance to the values he had sworn to uphold. He could see that Colonel Mitchell was in real danger, and every instinct told him to intervene, yet years of conditioning held him paralyzed at his post. General Blackwood began pacing again, his movements erratic and dangerous. 23 years I've given to this military," he muttered, his voice taking on an unhinged quality. 23 years of sacrifice, of making the hard decisions that kept this country safe. And now some upstart colonel thinks she can destroy me with paperwork and accusations. His pacing grew more frantic as his paranoia took hold. Sarah pulled herself fully upright, ignoring the pain that shot through her head with each movement. She could see that Blackwood was spiraling into complete madness, and she knew that her life was in genuine danger. The general had already crossed the line from verbal intimidation to physical assault, and she could see in his eyes that he was contemplating something far worse. "The evidence has already been copied and distributed," she lied, hoping to make him think twice about escalating further. The general stopped pacing and fixed her with a look of pure hatred. "You're lying," he snarled. "If you had backup copies, you would have mentioned them in your little presentation. You came here thinking you could blackmail me into submission, but you miscalculated badly." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper as he moved closer to Sarah. "The only question now is how to clean up this mess permanently." Lieutenant Torres realized with growing horror that he was witnessing the complete mental breakdown of his commanding officer. The general's words were becoming increasingly threatening, and the young lieutenant began to fear for Colonel Mitchell's life. He had heard rumors about officers who had crossed Blackwood in the past, officers who had suffered mysterious accidents or sudden career-ending scandals. Now he was beginning to wonder if those incidents had been more sinister than anyone had realized. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as Blackwood raised his hand again, this time balling it into a fist. Sarah braced herself for another blow, but she refused to close her eyes or show any sign of weakness. She had spent her entire career preparing for this moment, not the violence, but the test of her character under extreme pressure. Whatever happened next, she was determined to maintain her dignity and her principles. Sergeant Adams felt his resolve finally crystallize as he watched his commanding officer prepare to strike Colonel Mitchell again. The sergeant had served under Blackwood for years, following orders without question and maintaining absolute loyalty even when he disagreed with the general's methods. However, watching an unarmed officer being beaten by her superior was something that went against everything he believed in as a soldier and as a human being. The briefing room seemed to hold its breath as General Blackwood drew back his fist, his face twisted with murderous intent. The scattered documents on the floor bore silent witness to the corruption that had brought them all to this moment, while the portraits on the walls seemed to look down in judgment on the scene unfolding below them. In that instant, everyone in the room realized that they were about to witness something that would change all their lives forever. Sarah looked directly into Blackwood's eyes as he prepared to strike, and what she saw there chilled her to the bone. This wasn't just anger or even rage. It was the look of a man who had decided that murder was preferable to exposure. She realized that her investigation had uncovered more than just arms dealing. She had stumbled onto something so dark and extensive that Blackwood was willing to kill to protect it. As his fist began to move toward her face, she braced herself for what might be the final moments of her life. The intervention came in a blur of motion that seemed to unfold in slow motion. Sergeant Adams moved with the lightning reflexes of a combat veteran, his muscular frame intercepting General Blackwood's descending fist just inches from Colonel Mitchell's face. The collision between the two men sent them both stumbling, with Blackwood's momentum carrying him sideways into the conference table while Adams maintained his protective stance in front of the injured colonel. "Stand down, General," Adams commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had earned his rank through battlefield experience rather than political maneuvering. The sergeant's hand moved to his sidearm as he positioned himself between Blackwood and Mitchell, his years of combat training taking over as he assessed the threat level in the room. For the first time in his military career, he was directly defying a superior officer, but his conscience left him no choice. Corporal Johnson snapped out of his paralysis as he witnessed his partner's decisive action. The younger soldier moved to flank Blackwood from the other side, his own weapon drawn and trained on the general. "Sir, please step away from Colonel Mitchell," Johnson said, his voice trembling slightly but his resolve unwavering. The two enlisted men had served together for 3 years, and their partnership extended beyond mere military protocol to genuine friendship and mutual respect. General Blackwood stared at his own men in disbelief, unable to comprehend that his authority was being challenged by soldiers he had commanded for years. His face cycled through a range of emotions: shock, rage, betrayal, and, finally, a cold calculation as he realized the magnitude of his situation. "You dare point weapons at your commanding officer?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is mutiny. You know what happens to mutineers in wartime." Lieutenant Torres remained frozen against the wall, his military academy training warring with the reality of what he was witnessing. The young officer had been taught that the chain of command was sacred, that orders from superior officers were to be followed without question. Yet here he was watching his commanding general assault a fellow officer, while 2 enlisted men risked their careers to protect her. The lieutenant's worldview was crumbling as he struggled to process the moral complexity of the situation. Sarah slowly pulled herself to her feet using the wall for support, grateful for the protection provided by Adams and Johnson, but acutely aware that the situation had spiraled completely out of control. Blood continued to trickle from her lip, and her left eye was beginning to swell shut, but her mind remained sharp as she evaluated their options. The evidence of Blackwood's crimes was scattered across the floor, and she knew that without those documents, her investigation would be meaningless. "This is all a misunderstanding," Blackwood said, his tone suddenly shifting to one of false reasonableness. "Colonel Mitchell slipped and fell during our discussion. These brave soldiers are simply helping a fellow officer who suffered an unfortunate accident. His attempt at manipulation was transparently desperate, but Sarah recognized the dangerous cunning behind his words. The general was trying to create a narrative that would protect him while destroying everyone else in the room. Sergeant Adams kept his weapon trained on Blackwood while speaking over his shoulder to Colonel Mitchell. "Ma'am, are you able to move? We need to get you medical attention and ensure your safety." The sergeant's combat experience had taught him to prioritize the protection of wounded personnel, but he also understood that they were in uncharted territory from a military justice perspective. The general's eyes darted around the room, calculating his options as the reality of his situation began to sink in. He was trapped in a briefing room with witnesses to his assault on a fellow officer, and his own men had turned against him. Years of careful planning and meticulous cover-ups were unraveling in the space of minutes, all because of one stubborn colonel who refused to look the other way. His mind raced through possible escape scenarios, but each one seemed more desperate than the last. "You don't understand what you're doing," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that was completely at odds with his earlier aggression. "The operations that Colonel Mitchell is trying to expose are classified at the highest levels. They're sanctioned by agencies so far above your security clearance that you don't even know they exist. By protecting her, you're committing treason against your own country." Corporal Johnson's grip tightened on his weapon as he processed the general's words. The young soldier had joined the military out of genuine patriotism, believing that he was serving something greater than himself. However, what he had witnessed today challenged everything he thought he knew about honor, duty, and service. "Sir, with respect, assaulting a fellow officer isn't protecting national security," he said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. Sarah began carefully gathering the scattered documents, her movements deliberate despite her injuries. Each piece of paper represented hours of investigation and analysis, and she knew that without this evidence, Blackwood would find a way to spin the situation in his favor. The documents contained bank records, shipping manifests, and communication logs, she said, her voice directed at Adams and Johnson. Everything needed to prove that weapons were being sold to foreign mercenaries without authorization. Lieutenant Torres finally found his voice as he watched Colonel Mitchell collecting evidence. "General, sir, perhaps we should contact the military police and sort this situation out through proper channels," he suggested, his tone carefully neutral. The young officer was trying to find a middle ground that would allow everyone to retreat from the dangerous precipice they had reached, but he could see that Blackwood was beyond reason. The general's laugh was bitter and completely devoid of humor. "Proper channels? You think the military police aren't already compromised? You think this operation exists without the knowledge and approval of people far more powerful than any of us?" His paranoia was beginning to show as he realized that his carefully constructed network of protection was crumbling around him. Sergeant Adams maintained his defensive position while speaking to his partner. "Johnson, contact base security and request immediate assistance. Tell them we have a situation requiring senior military police personnel." The sergeant had made his decision to side with Colonel Mitchell, and now he was committed to seeing it through to whatever end awaited them all. Blackwood's demeanor shifted again as he realized that his men were completely beyond his control. The facade of reasonableness dropped away, replaced by the cold calculation of a cornered predator. "You have no idea what you've just unleashed," he said quietly. "The people I work with don't accept failure, and they don't leave loose ends. By choosing to side with her, you've signed your own death warrants." The general's threats only served to strengthen the resolve of the two soldiers protecting Colonel Mitchell. Adams had faced death in combat zones across 3 continents, and Johnson had proven his courage under fire during 2 deployments in hostile territory. Neither man was easily intimidated, particularly when they were fighting for something they believed in rather than simply following orders. Sarah finished gathering the most crucial documents and secured them in her briefcase, despite the pain that shot through her head with each movement. She could see that General Blackwood was becoming increasingly desperate, and she knew that desperation made him more dangerous than ever. The evidence she had collected represented years of work, but, more importantly, it was the key to exposing a network of corruption that reached far beyond one man's greed. The standoff in the briefing room had reached a critical juncture where any sudden movement could trigger an explosion of violence. General Blackwood stood isolated against the far wall, his career and his freedom hanging in the balance as he stared at the three people who now controlled his fate. The portraits of former commanders looked down on the scene with silent judgment, their painted eyes witnessing the complete breakdown of military discipline and honor. Lieutenant Torres slowly reached for his radio, intending to follow Sergeant Adams' suggestion about contacting base security. However, as his hand moved toward the device, General Blackwood's eyes locked onto the motion with predatory intensity. The general's hand dropped to his own sidearm as he realized that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Whatever happened in the next few moments would determine not just his own fate, but the lives of everyone in the room. The moment General Blackwood's hand moved toward his weapon, both Sergeant Adams and Corporal Johnson reacted with the precision of seasoned combat veterans. Their training kicked in automatically as they recognized the telltale signs of an imminent deadly force situation. The two soldiers moved in perfect synchronization, their weapons trained on the general while maintaining their protective formation around Colonel Mitchell. "General, remove your hand from your weapon immediately," Adams commanded, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of a man who had faced life and death situations numerous times. The sergeant's finger moved to the trigger guard of his sidearm as he prepared for the possibility that his commanding officer had completely lost touch with reality. Never in his worst nightmares had he imagined that he would be facing off against the man he had served loyally for years. Blackwood's hand froze halfway to his holster as he realized that his own men were fully prepared to use deadly force against him. The general's eyes darted between the two soldiers, calculating his chances of successfully drawing his weapon before they could react. His military training told him that the odds were heavily against him, but his desperation was overriding his tactical judgment with each passing second. Lieutenant Torres had finally managed to raise base security on his radio, though his voice trembled as he spoke into the device. "Base security, this is Lieutenant Torres in Conference Room Alpha. We have an emergency situation requiring immediate military police response. Multiple personnel involved, possible assault charges, weapons drawn." The young officer's words came out in a rush as he tried to convey the urgency of their situation without revealing too many details over an unsecured channel. Colonel Mitchell used the distraction to position herself near the door, though she remained ready to hit the floor if the situation escalated to gunfire. Despite her injuries, her military training kept her alert and focused on survival. She clutched her briefcase containing the incriminating evidence, knowing that those documents were more valuable than her own life in terms of the justice they could bring to countless victims of the general's corruption. The static-filled response from base security crackled through the radio. "Lieutenant Torres, military police en route to your location. Estimated arrival in 4 minutes. Maintain status quo until our arrival." The voice belonged to Sergeant Major Williams, a 30-year veteran who had dealt with countless disciplinary situations throughout his career. However, even Williams had never encountered a scenario involving a general officer threatening fellow personnel with deadly force. General Blackwood's breathing became increasingly labored as he processed the approaching footsteps in the hallway outside the briefing room. Each second brought him closer to complete disgrace and probable life imprisonment, assuming he survived the next few minutes. His carefully constructed facade of honor and duty was crumbling, revealing the ruthless criminal beneath the decorated uniform. "You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing," Blackwood said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "The network I work for extends into the highest levels of government and military leadership. They won't allow these operations to be exposed, and they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their interests." His words were both a threat and a warning, revealing the true scope of the corruption that Colonel Mitchell had uncovered. Sergeant Adams maintained his steady aim while responding to the general's threats. "Sir, the only thing I understand is that you assaulted a fellow officer and are now threatening the lives of your own men. Whatever justification you think you have doesn't excuse your actions today." The sergeant's voice remained calm and professional, but his eyes never wavered from Blackwood's position near his weapon. The sound of running footsteps in the corridor outside grew louder as the military police rapid response team approached their location. Corporal Johnson positioned himself to have a clear line of sight to both the general and the door, ensuring that he could react to threats from either direction. The young soldier's heart was pounding, but his training kept his hands steady and his mind focused on the tactical situation. Lieutenant Torres moved to unlock the briefing room door, preparing for the arrival of the military police while keeping his radio ready for further communication. The young officer had been thrust into a situation far beyond his experience level, but he was handling the crisis with remarkable composure. His actions would likely save his career while helping to bring a dangerous criminal to justice. General Blackwood's eyes showed the wild desperation of a cornered animal as he heard the approaching footsteps. In a last-ditch attempt to regain control, he began to slowly raise his hands in apparent surrender while taking a small step toward Colonel Mitchell. "Perhaps we can reach some kind of understanding," he said, his voice suddenly calm and reasonable. "I'm sure we can find a solution that benefits everyone involved." Sarah recognized the deception immediately, having studied Blackwood's psychological profile during her investigation. The general's apparent capitulation was simply another manipulation tactic, and she could see the calculation in his eyes as he positioned himself for a final desperate gambit. "Stay where you are, General," she commanded, her voice carrying newfound authority despite her injuries. The briefing room door burst open as the military police team entered with weapons drawn and tactical flashlights illuminating every corner of the room. The team leader, Staff Sergeant Martinez, quickly assessed the situation and began issuing commands to secure the scene. "Everyone remain exactly where you are and keep your hands visible," Martinez shouted, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Sergeant Adams and Corporal Johnson immediately identified themselves as friendly personnel while maintaining their protective stance around Colonel Mitchell. "Military police, we are Sergeant Adams and Corporal Johnson, currently protecting Colonel Mitchell from assault by General Blackwood," Adams announced clearly. His military bearing and professional demeanor helped the military police team quickly identify the legitimate threat in the room. General Blackwood's face went through a range of emotions as he realized that his career was effectively over. The military police had arrived before he could implement any escape plan, and the witnesses to his crimes were beyond his ability to intimidate or eliminate. His shoulders sagged as the weight of his situation finally sank in, and he slowly raised his hands in genuine surrender. Staff Sergeant Martinez approached the general with practiced caution, his weapon trained on Blackwood, while his team secured the other personnel in the room. "General Blackwood, I need you to slowly remove your sidearm using only 2 fingers and place it on the table," Martinez commanded. The military police sergeant had dealt with high-ranking personnel before, but never in a situation involving assault and weapons charges. The general complied with the order, his movements slow and deliberate as he placed his weapon on the conference table. Years of training and discipline warred with his desperate desire to escape, but the overwhelming tactical advantage of the military police team left him no viable options. His military career was ending in the most humiliating way possible, witnessed by the very men he had commanded and intimidated for years. Colonel Mitchell was immediately escorted to receive medical attention, her briefcase secured as evidence by the military police team. As medics examined her injuries, she provided a preliminary statement about the assault and the evidence of corruption that had precipitated the confrontation. Her voice remained steady and professional despite the trauma she had endured, demonstrating the courage and integrity that had driven her investigation from the beginning. Lieutenant Torres gave his statement to the investigating officers, his account corroborating the testimony of Sergeant Adams and Corporal Johnson. The young officer's detailed recollection of events helped establish a clear timeline of the assault and the general's threatening behavior. His radio communications with base security provided additional documentation of the incident's progression. As General Blackwood was placed in restraints and read his rights, he made one final attempt to salvage his situation. "This is all a terrible misunderstanding," he said to Staff Sergeant Martinez. "Colonel Mitchell's accusations are based on fabricated evidence designed to destroy my reputation. I was simply trying to counsel a subordinate officer about her inappropriate conduct." His words fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence and witness testimony. The military police completed their initial investigation and prepared to transport General Blackwood to the base detention facility pending a formal court-martial proceeding. As he was led from the briefing room in handcuffs, he passed the scattered documents that had triggered his downfall. The evidence of his crimes lay spread across the floor like pieces of a puzzle that would eventually reveal the full scope of his corruption and betrayal. Sergeant Adams and Corporal Johnson were commended for their actions in protecting Colonel Mitchell, though they would face extensive questioning about their decision to disobey direct orders from a superior officer. The military police investigation would ultimately vindicate their actions, establishing that they had acted properly in the face of unlawful commands and criminal behavior by their commanding officer. The investigation that followed would reveal the full extent of General Blackwood's criminal network, leading to arrests and prosecutions throughout the military hierarchy. Colonel Mitchell's courage in exposing the corruption would save countless lives and prevent millions of dollars in illegal weapons from reaching dangerous hands around the world. Her investigation had uncovered one of the largest military corruption scandals in decades, and her willingness to confront a dangerous superior officer had prevented an even greater tragedy from unfolding.